Through the mist and the autumn leaves, these grand buildings emerge, almost palatial.
At first glance, the architecture suggests old-fashioned opulence.
Then, jutting out in the center of this courtyard, this strange circular structure that looks altogether different in style.
This concrete addition is decorated with distinctive murals, hinting that this site had other powerful influences.
When you come on an example of something that's clearly alien to the middle of Europe, something that is clearly there because some other culture has implanted itself onto the soil of Germany.
Hundreds of disparate buildings extend across this huge stretch of Berlin suburbia. Inside, long corridors reveal endless empty rooms.
The theatre, the swimming pool, and many of the other facilities suggest something civilian. But then the maps and the murals give you the sense of something that feels far more military.
This place is cut off from everything around it. Isolated, derelict, and decaying, the buildings are a relic from the past. Who was this all for? And why did they leave?
Whoever was here obviously left in a mad rush, which begs the question, what forced them into such a sudden evacuation?
On one cold March day in 1994, this place changed forever. The people who lived here were leaving, and everything was in turmoil. Jürgen Naumann, now the site's caretaker, saw it for himself.
A certain chaos broke out. There was no discipline anymore. Order and discipline had gone down the drain. They sold everything here, from gasoline to Kalashnikovs.
The people leaving were part of a tiny elite. For decades, the site had been set off limits to everyone except them.
They annexed this neighborhood and they put this big wall around it. It was forbidden for any East German to go in there.
With over 600 buildings in an area encompassing more than 2.5 square miles, this site dominated everything around it. So what was it? When Hitler had been defeated in 1945, the Allied powers had split Germany in half. This divided country quickly became the center of Cold War tensions, and the Russians needed somewhere to station their troops.
When the Red Army took over Eastern Germany, the easiest thing for them to do was to take over existing German armed forces complexes from the Second World War.
When the Soviets arrived in April 1945, they found a large military complex, and they simply rolled in and took it over.
This is Wunsdorf, the headquarters of the Russian army in East Germany.
This was the most formidable concentration of Soviet armed might outside the borders of the Soviet Union.
The site was off limits to Germans, but some locals did find a way in to take part in shady dealings.
The whole place was surrounded by fences, and there were several entrances, large fortified gates with guards. But if you were to say, give a soldier a gift, they would let you in. You could go shopping here, buy some cigarettes, and, well, a lot of alcohol, because it was reasonably priced for those who like to drink a bit more.
By the late 1980s, Wunsdorf had become more than just an army camp. It was a whole forbidden city.
This place was home to 75,000 men, women, and children. It was known as Little Moscow. It had shops, schools, leisure facilities, even had a daily train service to the Soviet capital.
Here in Wunsdorf, this area served as the cultural centre for the Soviet citizens who lived here. There was a theatre with a lot of performances. In the big building behind me, there were exhibitions, museums, memorial rooms, and much more.
But all this would come to a dramatic end.
The huge Soviet infrastructure in East Germany was enormously expensive to maintain. And as the Soviet economy collapsed, the Soviet presence in Germany had to be pulled back.
After the reunification of Germany, the Russians agreed to withdraw all their troops by the end of 1994. But it was far from a straightforward process. For the officers and their families at Wunsdorf, life was turned upside down.
This very orderly society that the Red Army had lived under is now gone. The government handled this relocation of their forces very, very badly.
In many cases, families were given just 1 or 2 days to pack up and leave.
Jürgen Naumann remembers the deep distress felt by the Russians at the time.
Once, I went up to see a sales manager who I used to see almost daily. She was sitting in her office crying. She had 2 little children. She said, "We have to leave the country in 2 days, and I don't know where we are going."
The turmoil in Berlin had its roots 1,000 miles away. The government in Moscow was in chaos, and Wunsdorf's experienced officers were a threat to the president of the newly independent Russian state.
Boris Yeltsin had already survived 1 coup attempt. So with all these high-ranking and loyal Soviet soldiers being sent back to the motherland, they were purposefully split up and sent to different locations to reduce the risk of another attempted military coup.
Many of these soldiers didn't want to leave Wunsdorf. Would they refuse and challenge their rulers in Moscow?
Certainly, in many respects, the Red Army officers liked being stationed in East Germany because actually the standard of living in East Germany was way above the standard of living in Russia.
They had access to goods and shops that East Germans didn't have. They had swimming facilities, athletic facilities. You would not have known you were in East Germany.
Life was much harder for those who lived outside the gates. After 50 years under foreign rule, there was a danger that these East Germans might seize the chance for revenge on the Russians. For Jürgen, working nearby at the time, the new bad relationship between the 2 nations was a shock.
Suddenly, we were not their friends anymore. We were the enemy.
But serious violence in Wunsdorf was narrowly avoided, and the Russians left.
After 1 final military parade, they pulled out. And they left in their wake a site littered with ammunition, ordnance, and rubbish. Shops were simply abandoned, left full of electronics, TVs, radios, fridges. Houses were left full of domestic appliances.
And by the end of 1994, there were no more Russian troops in Germany. The buildings in Wunsdorf were handed back to the German government, but today the former Soviet city is still deserted. The only regular visitor is Jürgen Naumann.
In terms of the architecture, these are beautiful buildings, and I hope they will be restored soon. It's our history.